Plankton dominates the biological processes in the ocean. Planktonic organisms are microscopic, yet they play a major role in regulating the carbon budget of our planet and therefore in regulating our climate. They are also the basis of the food web and facilitates the production of marine living resources such as fish and shellfish that play an increasing role in feeding a growing human population. At the same time, it's obvious that marine ecosystems are threatened by pollution, by global warming, by ocean acidification, and by overfishing. And there is therefore a need to develop models, mathematical models, that allows us to assess the effect of environmental change on marine ecosystems. However, marine ecosystems are complex. Thousands of species interact with one another and with the environment in complicated ways. And the major overarching question therefore becomes, how can we describe and model marine ecosystems in a sufficiently simple way that allows us to assess the effects of environmental change? During the past years, we have been developing an approach that aims at exactly this, the so-called trait-based approach. Traditional descriptions of marine food webs and marine ecosystems considers the interactions between the many species and the environment. But there are at least two problems with that approach. The first problem is that if we want to embrace at least some of the complexity of marine ecosystems, then the descriptions becomes very, very complex, as illustrated here in this very simplified version or description of a marine food web. But there is another more fundamental problem, namely that interactions in the ocean are not between species. Interactions are between individuals. It's individuals that eat one another and that mate with one another. It's not species. The trait-based approach overcomes these two problems, at least in principle. By rather than considering species, it considers individuals that are characterized by a few key traits that are interrelated through trade-offs. If we can quantify these trade-offs, then the structure and function of an ecosystem emerges as a function of the interactions between individuals and the environment, according to the principle of survival of the fittest. There are two essential terms here, namely key trait and trade-offs, and let me explain what that means. A key trait is a property of an organism that is a main determinant of its Darwinian fitness. And the Darwinian fitness, in turn, is a measure of the success of an organism in undertaking the three fundamental functions of an organism, namely to survive, to feed, and to reproduce. However, there are conflicts between these missions. There are no organisms that perform optimally with respect to all of these three missions or functions at the same time. There are no superbugs. An organism that is searching food, for example, at the same time elevates itself to an elevated predation risk. And similarly, an organism that searches for a mate will run an elevated risk of running into a predator. Consider this example, for example, here. To the left, we have a copepod larvae that attacks its phytoplankton prey. It jumps forward towards the prey to capture it. But at the same time, if we focus out, there is a bigger zooplankton approaching the small guy. And in the moment that the small guy jumps forward to capture its prey, it generates a fluid disturbance in the water that is picked up by the bigger guy that then attacks the smaller guy. In this case, the small guy is lucky enough to be able to escape the attack, but the point here is that there is no free lunch. Foraging or collecting food exposes the copepod larvae to an elevated predation risk. Now, with the terms now in place, we can now describe the four components of the trait-based approach. The first component focuses on the individual and aims at identifying the few key traits of the main life forms in the ocean and quantifying the associated trade-offs. If we can do that, then we can write mathematical models that allows us to predict the distribution of traits in the ocean. For example, the trait composition of a community, of the spatial distribution of organisms with a particular trait. We can then test these models against observations of trait distributions arriving from observations made in nature. And then finally, we can use either the observed or the predicted trait distributions to say something about the function of an ecosystem. And the function of an ecosystem is exactly a result of the traits of the organisms making up the community rather than the species or the taxonomic affiliation. And so therefore the trait-based approach is particularly suitable to say something about ecosystem function. And the two functions that we focus on is first the ability of the ocean to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and secondly the ability of the ocean to produce fish, for example. Now, and let's take an example of the individual, the first component, the individual, that focuses on key traits of individual organisms and their trade-offs. And I will use zooplankton as an example and focus on its foraging traits. After all, foraging is the main function. An organism has to forage in order to survive and to reproduce. Zooplankton has three fundamental different ways of acquiring resources. They all feed on phytoplankton, and they can either do that by being ambush feeders, that is, sit and wait in the water and waiting for motile prey to pass by within their dining sphere, and then capture that prey. Or they can, as the guy in the middle here, they can cruise through the water and then capture prey that it encounters. Or finally, it can sit still in the water and generate a feeding current by beating its appendages or flagella to create a feeding current and then capture prey that arrives in the feeding current. So these three ways of feeding applies to all kinds of zooplankton independent of the species. Now it turns out that these three ways of feeding is not equally efficient. It turns out that the most efficient way of foraging is by creating a feeding current, while the least efficient way is to be an ambush feeder. And this begs the question, how come that not all zooplankton are generating feeding currents? And the reason is that there are trade-offs, because it turns out that the more efficient way of foraging is also the most risky one. So generating feeding current also exposes the zooplankton to a much higher predation risk than being an ambush feeder. So there are trade-offs. And again, these are the trade-offs that shape biological communities. How do we know this? Well, we know this through detailed studies of the feeding mechanisms in a variety of forms, of different species, in a variety of forms, and by describing and modeling the fluid dynamics of foraging. Of course, we cannot observe all species in the ocean, and the overarching or key question or real challenge becomes, how can we generalize to all species from the few types of organisms that we have studied? And we can do that exactly because we are aiming at understanding the physical mechanisms underlying the interactions between the organisms. And this exactly allows us to generalize, and it also allows us to write the trade-offs as mathematical equations. And this is exactly what is needed if we want to construct mathematical models of marine ecosystems. And that leads us to the second component of the trait-based approach, to produce predictive models. And I'll just show two examples of predicted trait distributions from this kind of models that both, as we shall see later, are relevant or important to describe the function of an ecosystem. The first example is the global distribution of foraging traits in zooplankton, where the red areas is the regions where the passive ambush feeders dominate, and the blue areas are the regions where the active feeders that generate a feeding current dominates. And the model is based exactly on the trade-offs that we have estimated in lab experiments. The second example is the global distribution of the sizes of zooplankton, where you can see that near the globes, the zooplankton are larger than near equator. Can we trust these models? Well, we can compare them with observations. So if you take the size distribution first, you can see the upper panel here shows the observed size distribution of the zooplankton in the ocean, and the lower one, again, that predicted. And in both cases, you can see that both the predicted and the observed size distribution shows that the biggest zooplankton are near the pole, and they're much smaller near the equator. The other example is the global distribution of trait distributions, or the foraging trait, where you can see the predicted trait distribution in the middle, and to the right you can see the observed trait distribution. And as is often the case, the observations are much more sparsely distributed than the theoretical predictions. But if we here to the left compare the latitudinal trend in the trait composition. Then you can see the black line is that modeled and the red dots is those observed. And you can see the models and the observation match fairly well with one another. So both of these traits will allow us to say something about ecosystem function, the final pillar of the trait-based approach. And the function that ecosystem function that we will focus on here is the role of the zooplankton in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Zooplankton remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in two ways. First, they feed on phytoplankton that has assimilated carbon dioxide. And part of what they eat is expelled as fecal pellets. As you can see here, this little zooplankton up here produces fecal pellets that sink rapidly to the ocean interior. That way, on a long time scale, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the second process is by the zooplankton doing vertical migrations. They feed in the surface layer during night and then swim down to depths during day, or they hibernate at several kilometers depths during the winter. In both ways, transporting carbon dioxide in the form of organic carbon from the atmosphere to the ocean interior. And that way removing carbon dioxide on a time scale of at least 1,000 years. Now, the point is that both of these two processes depend strongly on the two traits that we have been describing, namely the size distribution of the zooplankton and their foraging strategy. And I'll just show you one example of the model prediction that comes out of this exercise. And that describes the spatial distribution, how the spatial distribution of the ability of the zooplankton to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere has changed during the past 50 years. And the areas where it's green, this is in the North Atlantic, and in the green areas, there the ability of the zooplankton to remove carbon dioxide has increased, and in the red areas it has decreased during the past 50 years. And this is the result of global warming. Well, we are still developing this approach, and there is still a long way to go, but we are trying to apply it to other fundamental properties. For example, the ability of the ocean to produce fish, or trying to identify regions of the ocean that are particularly susceptible to pollution and overfishing. There's still a long way to go to polish and finalize this approach, but it's a promising alternative, or at least supplement, to the traditional way of describing and modeling marine ecosystems.